Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into something pretty fascinating. We're going to be talking about TikTok.
TikTok, huh?
Yeah, TikTok. But we're not talking about the dances and trends and all that stuff.
Right, right.
We're talking about how Americans are increasingly getting their news from TikTok.
Interesting. That's not really what you think of when you think about TikTok, is it?
Not really, no. You think of, I don't know, like I said, dance challenges and funny videos, all that.
Right.
But it turns out TikTok is becoming a major player in the news game.
Hmm. So where are we getting all this info from?
So for this deep dive, we've got some research from Pew, some analysis from PR Daily, and even some commentary from Net Influencer, all pointing to the same thing. A surprising number of people are getting their news from TikTok.
Okay, yeah, so what are the numbers here? Like, how many people are we actually talking about?
Well, Pew found that, get this, 52% of TikTok users regularly get news from the app.
Wow, 52%. That's more than half.
Yeah, and that's actually a really big chunk of the U.S. adult population.
Okay, so that is a lot of people. But I gotta ask, are they, like, actively following news organizations on TikTok?
That's a great question, and it's actually a little bit of a puzzle. The same Pew study found that less than 1%, actually way less, like 0.4% of the accounts followed by their sample of American TikTok users belong to journalists or news organizations.
Wait, so less than 1%, but over half of TikTok users are getting news from the app.
Exactly, so where's it coming from?
Yeah, where is it coming from?
Well, it turns out people are getting their news from, non-journalist accounts, influencers, celebrities, even just random people whose videos pop up on their For You page.
Oh, wow. So you're saying I could be scrolling through, watching some silly cat video, and then boom, suddenly I'm getting some breaking news update from, like, who knows, some random teenager.
Pretty much. And it's a totally different way to consume news.
It really is. It's so different from how we used to get news, you know?
Right? Like waiting for the evening news or grabbing a newspaper. It's a completely different world now.
And PR Daily point out that this presents a unique challenge for public relations professionals, you know?
Yeah, they're used to targeting journalists and traditional media outlets, but with TikTok, it's much more decentralized and harder to control, harder to pin down.
It's almost like the control over what's considered news is shifting away from those traditional gatekeepers, isn't it?
It really feels that way. And it's not just about who's delivering the news, it's also about the kind of content that people are consuming on TikTok.
Yeah. Okay, so what are people actually watching then?
I mean, I've seen my fair share of funny animal videos, but news, I'm not so sure.
Right, I hear you. Well, Pew found that a huge percentage of TikTok users, like around 84%, are seeing humorous posts about current events.
Oh, wow. Okay, so like news, but make it funny.
Exactly. Opinion pieces are also super popular, with 80% of users coming across those.
So it's more opinion driven, more personality driven.
Right. And then you have traditional news articles.
Okay, so those are still there.
They are there, yeah, but they're only seen by about 57% of users.
That's still a lot, but it's significantly less than those more entertaining formats.
Right, exactly. So it's almost like news is being integrated with entertainment on TikTok.
Which, I mean, it makes sense considering the nature of the platform.
Yeah. And Net Influencer actually has some interesting commentary about this. They emphasize the role of, well, independent influencers and even just regular people in shaping the news on TikTok.
Oh, that's an interesting point. So it's not just the big news organizations anymore. It's like everyone.
It seems that way. It's a much more diverse group of voices.
Wow, it really does feel like TikTok is making news more personalized, more, democratized.
That's a good word for it.
Yeah.
But what I'm really curious about is how is this impacting how people understand, the news, current events, all of that?
Me too. Because it seems like a pretty big shift from how things used to be.
It is a big shift. And one of the most interesting aspects of all this is that there's actually a pretty big generational divide in how people are engaging with news on TikTok.
Yeah, okay, that's something I was wondering about. I mean, I definitely see way more young people on TikTok, but are they actually getting their news from there?
They absolutely are. Pew found that a whopping 39% of adults under 30 get news on TikTok.
39%, that's huge.
It is. But when you look at people aged 65 and older, it's only 3%.
Wow, that's such a drastic difference. So not only are young people more likely to be on TikTok, they're also more likely to be getting their news from there.
Exactly. And it's not just about the overall numbers either. Young people are also way more likely to get their news from those news influencers.
How much more likely are we talking?
Well, 37% of young people are getting news from influencers, compared to just 7% of those over 65.
Okay, so it's not just that they're on TikTok, it's also who they're getting their news from while they're there. And that really seems like it could have some big implications for how different generations view the world.
Yeah. You know, one thing Pew points out is that younger adults tend to encounter news passively on TikTok.
Oh, interesting.
They're not necessarily going out and searching for it. They're just kind of stumbling upon it as they scroll.
Right, it's almost like news is just part of the entertainment mix for them. It's not this separate thing that they have to actively seek out.
That's a great way to put it. And that's very different from older generations.
Yeah, they're much more likely to sit down and watch the news or read a newspaper. It's intentional.
Exactly. They're actively seeking out news, especially political news.
So this makes me wonder, is this just a generational thing? Or is this like a sign of how we're all going to be consuming news in the future?
It's a question worth considering, for sure. Is this a phase, or is this the future of news? Something to think about as we keep going. And welcome back to our deep dive into news on TikTok.
Where we're trying to figure out how this whole thing is changing the way people get their news, especially like younger generations.
Right, and what that might mean for, like, the future of journalism, right?
Yeah, exactly. You know, one thing that really stuck out to me from the PR Daily article was how TikTok news really challenges our idea of what news even is.
Oh, yeah, totally.
Like, if we think of news as something, delivered by these big institutions with these strict standards, TikTok kind of throws that all out the window.
Yeah, it really does. I mean, on TikTok, anyone could go viral talking about, current events.
Exactly. Like, it doesn't matter what your background is or if you have any experience, you could still end up being someone's news source.
It's wild,
Yeah.
right? And it's not even just who's giving the news, it's also how it's presented, you know?
Yeah, for sure. Like with those short videos, news often ends up getting mixed with like entertainment and opinions and humor,
Totally.
which I gotta admit sometimes can be kind of refreshing. Like it's a nice change from like the super serious tone you usually get with traditional news.
Yeah, it definitely makes it, like, more accessible to people, especially maybe people who wouldn't normally watch the news.
Right. But I also wonder, like, does all this mixing of news and entertainment make it harder to tell what's fact and what's opinion?
Oh, for sure, especially, like you said, for younger users who might not, be as good at spotting those things.
Yeah, exactly. Like they might not have the same media literacy skills.
That's a good point. It really highlights how important critical thinking is, and being able to, like, evaluate sources and stuff.
Totally. Like it's more important now than ever to be able to like figure out if something's true or not and, recognize bias and all that.
Right. And thinking back to that generational divide we were talking about earlier,
Yeah.
it makes me wonder if this whole, like, news as entertainment thing is just like a young people thing.
Or if it's like the future of news for everyone.
Right, exactly. Like, is this just a phase, or is this how we're all going to be getting our news in a few years?
It's a good question. I don't know the answer, but it'll be interesting to see how things change.
Totally. Like, if TikTok's any indication, the future of news might be way more, like, dynamic and unpredictable than we're used to.
Right. It could be a wild ride. Okay, so we've established that TikTok's kind of turning the news world upside down. But I'm curious, what does this all mean for like actual journalists and news organizations?
That's the million-dollar question, right? Like,
Yeah.
how are they supposed to adapt to this new environment where, entertainment is king?
It's a tough spot to be in for sure.
It really is. They got to find ways to, reach people on these platforms like TikTok without, like, compromising their integrity.
Right. And they have to do it in a way that actually makes sense to younger generations.
Right, exactly. Like, it has to be authentic. It has to feel relevant.
Yeah.
It's not easy.
Not at all. So what can they do? Like what does PR Daily say?
Well, they pointed out that a ton of TikTok news consumers, something like 84% of them, are getting their news from people they don't even know.
Wow, that's a lot. So it's not just about like connecting with journalists or influencers. It's about like navigating this whole network of random people who are making and sharing news.
It's a different game entirely, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's not enough to just send out a press release anymore.
So what can PR professionals and news organizations do? How can they reach people on TikTok?
Well, it seems like building relationships is really important, like connecting with both established influencers and, up-and-coming creators.
So tapping into those existing networks.
Exactly. And, really understanding how TikTok works. Like, how to make content that looks good, that keeps people engaged, and that, fits with the whole short attention span vibe of TikTok.
Makes sense. And being willing to like experiment, right? Because TikTok's constantly changing.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Like, what works today might not work tomorrow, so you got to stay flexible.
It's a lot to keep up with, but I guess that's just how things are now.
Right, like the media landscape's always changing, so you got to be ready to adapt.
While we're talking about all the, opportunities and challenges and all that, I think we should also talk about, like, the ethical side of things.
Oh yeah, good point. Like, we can't just talk about reach and engagement and forget about, like, the potential downsides.
Exactly. And I think one of the biggest concerns with TikTok news is, like, misinformation.
Oh yeah, absolutely. With, those short videos and the algorithm and all that, it can be really hard to tell what's true and what's not.
Especially since, like we were saying, a lot of people are getting their news from sources that might not, fact check as rigorously as traditional news outlets.
So it's super important for anyone sharing news on TikTok to be really careful about checking their sources and making sure what they're sharing is accurate.
Totally. And being transparent about where the information came from,
Right.
right? Like, people should know how it was vetted.
Oh yeah, that's huge. Building trust is super important, especially in a place like TikTok, where false information can spread so quickly.
For sure. And another ethical thing to think about is, like, bias.
Right, especially with the algorithm,
Hmm.
Like, it's personalized, so people are often seeing content that just reinforces their existing beliefs.
Which can lead to, like, echo chambers, right? Where people are only hearing from people who agree with them.
Exactly, and that can really polarize things, It makes it harder to have, like, productive conversations.
Yeah, that's a problem. So I guess what you're saying is that content creators on TikTok need to be aware of their own biases and try to be fair and balanced.
For sure. Like, they need to show different viewpoints and not just push their own agenda.
And be open to talking to people who disagree with them, respectfully.
Yeah, exactly. It's about fostering, like, a healthy and informed conversation, even on a platform like TikTok.
Okay, so we've talked about the ethical considerations, but what about the impact on, like, traditional journalism?
Right. Like, it seems like TikTok is attracting a lot of young people that, traditional news outlets are struggling to reach.
And if those outlets can't find a way to connect with those audiences, it's like, what happens then?
Yeah, they risk becoming irrelevant, which is a scary thought.
It really is. So they
Oh,
have
yeah.
to adapt, right? They have to figure out how to reach these younger generations.
Absolutely. And they have to do it in a way that makes sense on TikTok. It's
Mhm.
got to be engaging, it's got to be visual, it's got to be fast-paced.
But it's not just about changing the format, right? It's also about understanding what younger audiences care about, what their values are.
Exactly. And it's about finding that balance between being informative and being entertaining without, sacrificing journalistic integrity.
Right. It's a tough needle to thread. So as we're wrapping up this part of our deep dive, it's clear that this whole TikTok news thing is, well, it's complicated.
Yeah, it really is. It's got opportunities and challenges for everyone involved, from the content creators to the people consuming it.
Right. Like, we have to be careful about misinformation and bias, but we also have to recognize that TikTok has the potential to reach people in a way that traditional news just can't.
And we need to keep having these conversations,
Yeah,
Like, keep talking about the complexities of all this and how it's changing how we get our news and understand the world.
totally. We'll be back in just a minute to finish up our exploration of news on TikTok and offer some final thoughts.
So stick with us.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been talking all about news on TikTok.
Yeah, it's pretty wild to see how this platform is, changing the way we think about news.
Totally. Like, it's blurring the lines between, straight up information and entertainment.
And it's making us ask some pretty big questions about the future of journalism.
Right. So as we wrap this up, I think it'd be good to, take a minute and think about everything we've talked about.
Yeah, sounds good to me.
And maybe even make a few guesses about what's next for news, in this TikTok world.
For sure. So what are some of the, like, big takeaways for you?
I think the biggest one for me is that TikTok has totally changed how people get their news.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Yeah.
Like, it's not just about those, traditional news organizations anymore.
Right, exactly. It's about what people see when they're scrolling, like what catches their eye.
And those algorithms have so much power. Right.
Oh, yeah, tons of power. They're basically deciding what people see and how they understand what's going on in the world.
Which is kind of a scary thought when you really think about it.
It is, yeah. Like, it's cool because it gives more people a voice, It's not just the same old voices all the time.
Right. And it makes it more personal. Like, people can find news that's actually relevant to them.
But then there's a whole echo chamber problem and, the spread of misinformation.
Yeah, that's the downside. It's like a double-edged sword, I guess.
Totally. So what I'm getting at is I think we have to be way more careful about what we believe now.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Like, especially when we're getting our news from sources we don't really know that well.
Exactly. We can't just like passively take in whatever we see. We have to actually think about it, you know?
Totally. Like, question things, check if they're true, look for different perspectives.
Right. And remember that those algorithms, like, their goal isn't to give us the most accurate information, it's to keep us on the app.
That's a good point. So looking ahead, I think one of the biggest questions is, can traditional news organizations keep up?
Can they figure out how to connect with younger audiences who are, basically living on TikTok?
Yeah, and can they do it in a way that, actually works on TikTok? Like, can they be authentic and engaging and all that without, you know, compromising their standards?
It's a big challenge. I'm not sure what the answer is.
Me neither. But they got to do something, right? They can't just ignore it and hope things go back to how they were.
Definitely not. They need to be creative. They need to try new things. They need to figure out how to make news relevant to this new generation.
And what about us, the people who are reading and watching all this news?
Yeah, what about us? What's our responsibility in all of this?
I think we have to be active. Like, we can't just sit back and let the algorithms decide what we see.
We have to be more intentional about what we consume and where we get our information from.
Totally. Like, step outside our comfort zones, question what we see, make sure our sources are good.
Because honestly, in this TikTok world, it's on us to make sure we're staying informed.
Couldn't agree more. Well, I think that about wraps up our deep dive.
Yeah, I think so too. Hopefully this has given everyone some food for thought.
Some things to, mull over as you continue your adventures on TikTok.
That's right. And remember, stay curious, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.